Hidden beneath the scorching Yucatán sun stands a pyramid that defies time, logic, and even the heavens themselves. Chichen Itza, the city where gods walked among men, where shadows told stories, and where sacrifice met the stars. What secrets did the Maya leave encoded in stone? And why does this ancient city still whisper to those who dare to listen? Before the name Chichen Itza echoed through the centuries, there was only jungle, endless green swallowing the horizon, broken by the cry of tropical birds and the hiss of wind over limestone. Yet, beneath this wilderness, the Maya saw more than wilderness. They saw sacred design. The Yucatan Peninsula had no rivers, but beneath its skin ran veins of fresh water, the cenotes, shimmering underground wells that connected the mortal world to Xibalba, the underworld of the gods. For the ancient Maya, that meant one thing: this land was alive with divine power. Around the 6th century A.D., a group of Maya settlers, possibly from the nearby city of Yaxuna, followed the whispers of their priests and the constellations in the night sky. They stopped where the largest cenote shimmered under the moonlight, a perfect gateway to the spiritual realm. There they began building what would become Chichen Itza, at the mouth of the well of the Itza. Every stone they placed, every stair they raised, was a conversation with the gods. The earliest temples were modest, thatched sanctuaries built to honor the rain god Chak, who ruled over life itself in a land where drought could mean death. Farmers prayed here before the planting season, offering maize, jade, and incense into the sacred water. Slowly, the city grew around these rituals, its buildings aligning with the sun's path and the stars above. The Maya were not simply constructing shelters. They were designing a calendar in stone. By the 9th century, the city had become a marvel of geometry and faith. The builders used limestone carved from nearby quarries, their hands guided by astronomer priests who calculated the heavens with astonishing accuracy. The placement of each temple reflected the motion of Venus, the timing of eclipses, and the rhythm of seasons. The city became a living observatory, a bridge between sky and earth. Yet Chichen Itza was not just a city of science. It was also a city of mystery and power. Smoke from burning copal resin rose through the jungle canopy, like prayers turned to mist. Drums and conch shells echoed at dawn, calling the people to ceremonies that honored life, death, and the gods who commanded both. The people believed their rulers were chosen by divine right, that the very breath of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god, flowed through their leaders. As the years passed, Chichen Itza became the beating heart of the Maya world. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims came from far lands, bringing obsidian from the highlands, turquoise from the north, and cacao beans from the south. The city thrived as a spiritual and commercial center, a sacred crossroads between civilizations. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows danced across the stone steps of what would one day become El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan. Though its first version was simpler, its purpose was clear: to honor the union of heaven and earth. It marked the moment when day met night, when the gods and men shared the same breath. No one could yet imagine the heights Chichen Itza would reach, or the blood it would demand in return. The city that began with whispered prayers beside a sacred well was destined to become one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world, and one of its darkest mysteries. By the dawn of the 9th century, Chichen Itza was no longer a mere settlement hidden in the jungle. It was the heartbeat of an empire. The Itza people, from whom the city took its name, were unlike any other Maya group. They were traders, scholars, warriors, and mystics. To outsiders they seemed almost divine, their knowledge stretching from the stars to the seas. The Itza had a gift, the ability to blend the mystical with the practical. They built roads of white limestone, called sakbib, that glowed under the moonlight, linking distant cities across the Yucatán. These were not only trade routes, but spiritual arteries through which life and belief flowed. Merchants carried salt, jade, obsidian, feathers, and cacao, but also carried stories of gods, omens, and distant lands beyond the horizon. At the heart of their society was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, half bird, half snake, a god of wind, wisdom, and creation. To the Itza, Kukulkan was not only a deity, but a symbol of transformation, bridging sky and earth, life and death, power and humility. Every ruler claimed to speak in his name. The high priests read the stars to interpret his will, while kings led ceremonies to ensure his favor remained upon the city. Chichen Itza's architecture reflected this duality of the Itza soul, discipline and devotion, mathematics and mysticism. Their temples were not random creations, but precise expressions of cosmic order. The alignment of buildings mirrored the movements of the planets. Their proportions reflected sacred numbers, 4 for the cardinal directions, 13 for the heavens, 9 for the underworld. To live in Chichen Itza was to live inside a universe carefully designed by human hands, yet guided by divine logic. Social life revolved around these beliefs. The Itza elite lived near the central plazas in stone palaces carved with serpents, jaguars, and warriors, symbols of courage and protection. The common people lived further out, their homes made of wood and thatch, simple yet clean, surrounded by gardens of maize, beans, and squash. Despite this hierarchy, every member of society had a role in maintaining the cosmic balance. Farmers prayed before planting. Masons chanted before lifting stone. Even children were taught the stories of creation by the fireside. The Itza were also remarkable astronomers. Night after night, their priests studied the heavens from observatories like El Caracol, a rounded tower whose windows perfectly framed the paths of Venus and the sun. Through their calculations, they built one of the most accurate calendars in human history, a 365-day solar year that rivaled even that of the Egyptians. But for all their brilliance, the Itza's devotion carried a darker side. They believed that the gods who granted them knowledge could just as easily take it away. Balance demanded blood. The Itza saw sacrifice not as cruelty, but as currency, life offered to sustain life. When drought struck or the stars foretold chaos, hearts were given to the gods. The cries of the chosen rose with the smoke of incense, a reminder that even the wise must pay for harmony. As Chichen Itza's power grew, so did its influence. The city became a beacon that drew others under its shadow. Lesser kingdoms paid tribute. Priests and scholars traveled from afar to learn from the Itza, yet this expansion would sow the seeds of conflict. For with power came envy, and soon the eyes of distant warriors began to turn toward the city of the Feathered Serpent. The Itza people had built a paradise of order and devotion. What paradise, history would show, is fragile. The next century would test their gods, their kings, and their very faith in the harmony they had created. Rising above the jungle like a stairway to the heavens, the Pyramid of Kukulkan, El Castillo, became the soul of Chichen Itza. Its presence dominated every horizon, a masterpiece of both faith and engineering, standing as proof that the Maya had not merely observed the cosmos, they had mastered it. The pyramid was not just a temple, it was a calendar carved in stone. Built sometime between the 9th and 12th centuries, it soared nearly 30 meters high, each of its 4 sides containing 91 steps, one for each day of the year, with the top platform completing the 365. The structure aligned perfectly with the sun's motion, transforming into a living spectacle twice a year during the spring and autumn equinoxes. On those 2 sacred days, thousands would gather in the plaza to witness what they believed was the descent of the god Kukulkan himself. As the sun lowered, the pyramid's edges cast a ripple of triangular shadows upon the northern staircase, forming the illusion of a serpent slithering down the temple to meet a stone serpent head at the base. To the Maya, it was not illusion, it was revelation. The god had returned to bless his people. The builders of El Castillo achieved this perfection without modern tools, metal, or even the wheel. Every angle, every proportion was deliberate. The pyramid faced true north, with slight adjustments that accounted for the Earth's tilt, a feat that demonstrated an understanding of astronomy unmatched for its time. Within its limestone heart, layers of older temples were discovered centuries later, each one built atop the other, preserving the city's spiritual lineage like the rings of a sacred tree. The inner sanctum once held a jade-covered throne in the shape of a jaguar, its eyes made of gleaming obsidian. Only priests and kings could ascend the pyramid, their footsteps echoing like thunder across the plaza as drums beat below. Ceremonies here were not for the faint-hearted. Bloodletting and sacrifices were offered to renew the cycle of time, to ensure the sun would rise and the rains would come. To the Maya, the pyramid was also a map of existence. The 9 terraces symbolized the 9 layers of the underworld, and the temple at the top represented the heavens. Between them stood humanity, forever climbing, forever seeking balance between light and darkness. At night, under the cold light of the stars, the pyramid glowed faintly silver, its outline merging with the constellations above. Priests believed Kukulkan's spirit lived within its stones, guiding them through the ages. Some even claimed that the pyramid itself was alive, that it could speak. Modern scientists later discovered that clapping at its base produces an echo that mimics the chirp of the sacred Quetzal bird, the divine messenger in Maya mythology. Whether by design or divine coincidence, the effect immortalized the Maya's fusion of sound, science, and spirituality. El Castillo became the center of everything, rituals, politics, and prophecy. It stood as both stage and sanctuary, where the fate of crops, kings, and empires was decided under the watching eyes of gods. But for all its beauty, the pyramid's shadow held darkness. Some believed its perfection demanded a price, that every alignment with the heavens required human life to seal its harmony. The priests of Kukulkan ruled with divine authority, their word as absolute as the sun's path. And as the Itza civilization grew wealthier and more powerful, so too did their hunger for control. The Pyramid of Kukulkan was more than stone. It was the embodiment of belief, the delicate balance between knowledge and fear. Its stairways rose toward enlightenment, yet its depths whispered of blood and sacrifice. And as the sun continued to carve the serpent cenote across its face, few could imagine that this masterpiece, This bridge between man and God would one day stand silent, its secrets buried beneath centuries of dust and forgotten prayers. If El Castillo was the spiritual heart of Chichen Itza, then the Temple of the Warriors was its soul of power, a monument to divine authority and human conquest. Rising just east of the pyramid, this sprawling complex revealed a darker, more disciplined side of the Maya world, a civilization where religion and warfare were two faces of the same god. The temple stood upon a broad, stepped platform, its summit crowned with columns carved into warriors, stone sentinels frozen in eternal vigilance. Each figure bore shields, feathered headdresses, and obsidian-tipped weapons, their eyes wide, their mouths stern. These were not mere decorations. They were guardians of a sacred order, protectors of the balance between the mortal realm and the divine. At the top rested a Chakmul statue, a reclining figure holding a bowl across its stomach. Into that bowl priests once placed offerings to the gods, flowers, food, and sometimes human hearts still pulsing with the rhythm of life. The rituals here were not acts of cruelty, but of cosmic necessity. The Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. In return, humanity must give blood to keep it alive. Below, the Temple of the Warriors opened onto the group of 1,000 columns, an immense forest of pillars that stretched toward the horizon. Once these columns supported a vast roof of wood and stone, a grand assembly hall where warriors trained, merchants bartered, and councils planned their next campaigns. Each pillar told a story, carvings of battle, tribute, and divine blessing, reminders that Chichen Itza prosperity was born not only from faith but also from conquest. Beyond the temple complex lay a structure that spoke to the Maya's fascination with both sport and sacrifice, the Great Ball Court. The largest in Mesoamerica, it was 168 meters long and 70 meters wide, surrounded by towering stone walls. At the center of each wall, a carved ring stood high above the ground, through which players had to pass a solid rubber ball, using only their hips and forearms. The game was more than competition. It was ritual drama, a symbolic reenactment of the eternal struggle between life and death, light and darkness, the gods of creation and the lords of the underworld. The stakes, however, were terrifyingly real. Some games ended with human sacrifice. Whether of the losers or the victors remains debated. In Maya belief, to die on this court was not punishment, but transcendence. It was an honor to feed the gods with one's own life. The walls of the court were lined with carvings that told of this sacred violence, rows of players, their heads severed, with serpents of blood emerging from their necks, transforming into flowers and sacred symbols. The Maya saw death not as an end, but as transformation, life blooming from the soil of sacrifice. When the drums thundered and conch shells wailed, the entire city gathered. The chants of thousands echoed through the air, bouncing off the stone in a perfect acoustic marvel. Words spoken on one end could be heard clearly on the other. It was as if the gods themselves were listening. These monuments, the Temple of the Warriors and the Great Ball Court, revealed a truth about Chichen Itza people. They were neither savage nor saint. They lived by the conviction that the universe demanded balance, that creation required destruction, and that beauty could not exist without fear. But within these rituals of order, a quiet shadow grew. As the city's wealth expanded and its reach extended across the peninsula, so too did the thirst for domination. The warriors who once fought for faith began to fight for power. The sacrifices that once honored the gods began to serve the ambitions of men. The temple's stone guardians would one day watch silently as the empire they protected turned upon itself, and as the blood once offered to the gods was spilled by brother against brother. To the people of Chichen Itza, water was life and death. In the dry limestone lands of the Yucatán, where rivers hid beneath the earth, the Maya turned to the cenotes, the natural sinkholes that pierced the surface like open eyes staring into the underworld. Of all these, one was unlike any other, the cenote sagrado, or sacred well. It was the beating heart of the city's spirituality, the very portal through which humans could speak to the gods. From above, it looked like a vast circle of emerald water, surrounded by sheer cliffs of limestone, 80 feet deep and dark as eternity. Mist rose from its surface in the mornings, and the jungle around it was heavy with silence, the kind of silence only found in places where the living fear to tread. For the Maya, this was not just a natural wonder. It was an entrance to Xibalba, the underworld. Every drought, every famine, every unanswered prayer led them here. Priests in white robes stood at the edge, chanting to Chak, the rain god, their voices echoing off the rock walls. The city gathered in silence as offerings were cast into the deep gold, jade, obsidian blades, and the most sacred of all offerings, human life. The chosen ones, often young and pure, were painted blue, symbolizing the color of the sky and the divine rain. They were believed to journey into the cenote, not to die, but to deliver messages to the gods on behalf of their people. As they fell, the chants rose higher, the drums beat louder, and the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Once the ripples faded, only silence remained, and faith. The Maya believed that if Chak was pleased, the rains would return, the crops would grow, and the balance would be restored. Centuries later, when explorers dredged the cenote, they found the truth buried beneath the myth. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of artifacts, jewelry, pottery, weapons, and human bones. Some skeletons bore marks of ritual wounds. Others showed no struggle at all, as if they had gone willingly. Among them were remains of men, women, and children, proof that the cenote had been both temple and tomb for generations. The practice may seem brutal to modern eyes, yet for the Maya it was an act of profound devotion. They believed that life was cyclical, that death was merely the beginning of another journey. To be chosen as an offering was not punishment, but transcendence, an honor that ensured one's spirit would walk beside the gods forever. The sacred cenote was also a political instrument. The priests who controlled it wielded immense power. To command the gods' favor was to command the people's faith. When drought struck, the king's authority depended on Chak's mercy. A failed sacrifice or a season without rain could mean rebellion. Thus, religion and governance were inseparable, both sustained by the waters of the well and the fear that dwelled within its depths. Even today, as sunlight filters through the jungle canopy and dances upon the cenote's surface, there is an unsettling stillness in the air. The water remains cold, deep, and eerily quiet. Locals say that on certain nights when the wind shifts and the moon glows high, you can still hear faint chants echoing from the depths, voices calling out from another world. The cenote sagrado was not merely a well. It was the spine of Chichen Itza, Siso, a reminder that the Maya lived not to conquer nature, but to converse with it. It was here that the gods were fed, and here that the city's fate was sealed, one offering at a time. If the sacred cenote was the heart of Chichen Itza, then its mind was the sky. The Maya did not simply look upward in wonder. They studied, measured, and recorded the heavens with a precision that still astonishes modern astronomers. For them, the stars were not distant suns. They were gods, storytellers, and clocks ticking toward destiny. Every movement in the heavens carried meaning. The priests of Chichen Itza spent their nights atop observatories, tracking the dance of Venus, the phases of the moon, and the turning of constellations. The building known as El Caracol, the snail, was their sanctuary of science. Its circular tower with slanted windows cut into thick walls, perfectly aligned with celestial events, the rising of Venus, the solstices, the equinoxes. When the light of the morning star pierced through its openings, it was a sign, messages from the gods that guided the fate of kings and farmers alike. The Maya calendar was the backbone of their civilization. But in Chichen Itza, it became divine art. They used two systems, the Hab, a solar calendar of 365 days, and the Tzolk'in, a sacred ritual calendar of 260 days. Every 52 years, these two cycles aligned, a moment of cosmic renewal called the calendar round. To the Maya, this convergence was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The world, they believed, could end and begin anew at that moment. Numbers held spiritual power. The number 4 represented the directions, 9 the layers of the underworld, and 13 the levels of heaven. Together, they wove the structure of the universe. These numbers appeared everywhere, in the steps of temples, the design of altars, and the length of ceremonial intervals. For the Maya, mathematics was not abstract. It was sacred geometry. Each calculation mirrored divine order. Through these observations, the priests predicted eclipses, harvest seasons, and the coming of rains. Farmers planted according to the stars. Kings declared wars and coronations based on celestial omens. When Venus vanished into the sun's glare and reappeared days later, it symbolized death and resurrection. To the people of Chichen Itza, even chaos followed a pattern, one written in light. But among all their prophecies, one stood above the rest, the return of Kukulkan, the Feathered Serpent. According to their legends, Kukulkan had once descended from the sky to bring knowledge to humanity, the secrets of numbers, writing, and time itself. He promised to return one day, descending again upon the temple that bore his name. This prophecy shaped their every ritual. The equinox ceremony at El Castillo was not just spectacle. It was the reenactment of Kukulkan's descent. As the serpent shadow slithered down the steps, the people believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new age, a cycle closing, and another opening. Some scholars believe that the priests used these prophecies to maintain control, intertwining faith and calculation to rule both mind and spirit. Others argue that the Maya genuinely believed in the cycles of divine return, their entire worldview resting on the principle that time was not linear but eternal, looping endlessly like the serpent that devoured its own tail. Even in decline, when droughts darkened the skies and the people despaired, they looked upward for meaning. To them, every misfortune was written among the stars. The heavens had blessed them once, surely they would again. Modern scientists still marvel at the accuracy of their calculations. The Maya predicted solar eclipses centuries in advance and measured the year to within minutes of modern calculations, all without telescopes. using only shadows, reflections, and pure intellect. But for the people of Chichen Itza, knowledge was never just science. It was prophecy, poetry, and power. To understand the sky was to understand the gods themselves, and as their gaze stretched endlessly toward the stars, they believed that in deciphering the cosmos, they were also decoding their own destiny. By the end of the 10th century, the horizon over Chichen Itza began to darken with the smoke of distant wars. Far to the northwest, another powerful civilization was rising, the Toltecs of central Mexico, led by a warrior priest known in legend as Acatl Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl, the man who would become one with the Feathered Serpent god. His name, his symbol, and his ideology would soon reshape the destiny of the Maya's greatest city. The Toltecs were a people of iron will, disciplined, militarized, and devoted to the worship of gods who demanded both blood and victory. When they reached the Yucatán Peninsula, whether by conquest, alliance, or migration, their arrival marked a new era for Chichen Itza. The blending of Maya and Toltec culture created something extraordinary, a city that was at once scientific and savage, spiritual and imperial. Archaeologists can still trace this transformation in stone. New temples rose across the city, bearing imagery never seen before in the Maya world. The Temple of the Warriors, once purely symbolic, now displayed carvings of Toltec soldiers, wielding atlals, spear throwers, wearing eagle and jaguar skins, symbols of elite warrior orders. Feathered serpents intertwined with skulls and battle scenes, blending the grace of Kukulkan with the brutality of war. The message was clear. The gods now demanded not only devotion but dominance. Trade routes expanded across the peninsula. Obsidian, turquoise, and gold flowed into Chichen Itza from as far as Tula and beyond. The city became an empire, its influence stretching deep into Central America. The great market near the plaza bustled with traders, nobles, and emissaries. The scent of cacao and incense filled the air, while the temple drums echoed like thunder over the limestone plain. But with this newfound power came fear. The Itza, who once saw Kukulkan as a god of wisdom and renewal, now revered him as a bringer of conquest. The Toltec version of the Feathered Serpent, Quetzalcoatl, was both a creator and a destroyer, embodying duality in all things. To please him, blood was shed on an unprecedented scale. The sacrifices that once honored the gods became instruments of political control. It was during this period that the second, grander version of El Castillo was built, the one we know today. Its design reflected both cultures, the precise astronomical alignments of the Maya combined with the symbolic militarism of the Toltecs. The serpent to set on the equinox now stood not only for cosmic harmony, but also for the divine right of rulers to command and to conquer. Legends speak of a time when Kukulkan himself returned, not as a god, but as a man. Some say he was the Toltec king, Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who fled his homeland and was welcomed by the Itza as a divine emissary. Under his guidance, Chichen Itza flourished like never before. Art, architecture, and science reached their zenith. The people called this the Golden Age of Kukulkan. Yet, as with all empires built on power, shadows followed the light. Rival factions emerged within the priesthood, some loyal to the peaceful teachings of the old Maya faith, others to the bloody demands of the Toltec gods. The balance that had once held the city together began to falter. Behind the gleaming temples and orderly plazas, Whispers of rebellion grew louder. The Toltec influence had given Chichen Itza its might, but it also sowed the seeds of its undoing. The feathered serpent that united two worlds, Maya and Toltec, would one day coil back upon itself, striking with the same fury it had once inspired. The city that reached for the stars was beginning to tremble beneath its own weight. The centuries that followed the Toltec arrival marked the height of Chichen Itza's glory, an age when the city shone like a jewel in the heart of the Yucatán jungle. From its temples to its marketplaces, from its astronomers to its warriors, every stone, every breath in Chichen Itza seemed to vibrate with divine purpose. It was an era when gods and mortals walked the same earth, and the city stood as the spiritual and economic center of the Maya world. Merchants arrived from every corner of Mesoamerica, the highlands of Guatemala, the Gulf of Mexico, the valleys of Oaxaca. The great market, spread out before the temple of the warriors, became a living sea of color and sound. Traders laid out turquoise from the north, obsidian from the volcanic lands, shells from the Korean, jaguar pelts, and intricate gold jewelry from faraway lands. Cacao beans served as currency, and the air was thick with the fragrance of roasted maize, honey, and incense. Above this thriving economy stood the priestly elite, astronomers, mathematicians, and seers who guided every aspect of life. They read the stars not only for ritual, but for strategy, determining when to plant, when to trade, when to go to war. Every major decision, from diplomacy to harvest, was timed according to the heavens. The priest's word was absolute, for they alone understood the voice of the gods. At night, the city transformed into a theater of light and fire. Torches illuminated the pyramids, and drums echoed through the jungle, as thousands gathered for festivals that blended faith with spectacle. Dancers painted in vivid blues and reds reenacted the myths of creation, the birth of the sun, the battles of the underworld, the eternal dance of Kukulkan. The air pulsed with the rhythm of life itself. During this golden era, Chichen Itza's architecture reached perfection. The temple of the warriors, El Caracol, the nunnery, and the platform of the eagles and jaguars rose in breathtaking symmetry. Each building served a cosmic purpose, aligning with celestial bodies and earthly directions. The city was no longer just a home. It was a universe constructed in stone. Education flourished as well. The sons of nobles were trained in astronomy, writing, law, and warfare. They learned to carve stele, to interpret hieroglyphs, and to chant the sacred hymns. Music and poetry celebrated both the gods and human triumphs. Even sports, particularly the ritual ball game, became grand public ceremonies that reflected the city's harmony with divine order. The people of Chichen Itza saw themselves as chosen, the bridge between heaven and earth. They believed their city to be the navel of the world, the axis through which all spiritual energy flowed. Their faith in Kukulkan and Shak was absolute, their confidence in their own greatness unshaken. To them, no force on earth could rival their civilization. Yet beneath this brilliance, faint cracks began to appear. Power, once shared between priests and kings, became concentrated in the hands of a few. The ruling class grew more indulgent, adorning themselves with gold and jade, while the common people toiled longer in the fields. The temple rituals became increasingly extravagant and increasingly bloody. Some among the priests began to question whether the gods truly demanded so much suffering. Others insisted that the sacrifices were what kept the sun rising. The city, for all its wealth and beauty, was becoming a stage for competing ideologies, one of faith, one of fear. Still, for a time, the illusion held. The trade routes remained open, the festivals continued, and the gods seemed to smile upon the city. Rain fell when needed, crops thrived, and the fires of the temples never went out. Chichen Itza stood at the pinnacle of its existence, radiant, unstoppable, eternal. But history is a patient sculptor. The same forces that build empires also erode them. And in the silence between chants and ceremonies a slow shift began, in the climate, in the hearts of men, and in the stars themselves. The golden age would soon darken. Every empire believes it will last forever. But time, like the gods the Maya worshipped, demands balance, creation followed by decay. What began as whispers in the jungle soon became the sound of an empire cracking beneath its own weight. By the 12th century, this city that once glowed with divine order began to unravel. The skies grew dry, the rain god Chak fell silent, and the fertile lands of the Yucatán turned to dust. Crops failed, cenotes shrank, and hunger crept into the markets that once overflowed with abundance. The priests offered more blood, more hearts, more desperate prayers, but the heavens remained indifferent. Faith began to tremble. As famine deepened, so did division. The alliance between the Maya and the Toltecs fractured. Once united by shared belief and ambition, the ruling classes now turned against one another. Some clung to the old Maya ways, the worship of Chak and the cycles of nature. Others remained loyal to the Toltec gods, whose hunger for sacrifice knew no end. In the plazas where once stood harmony, now stood tension. Civil unrest spread. Rival city-states, Mayapan, Uxmal, and others, began to challenge Chichen Itza's dominance. Trade routes that once fed the city's wealth were severed. The great market fell silent, its stalls abandoned, its merchants gone. The temples, once filled with the echo of prayer, became hollow monuments. The people began to leave, not all at once, but in waves, as if retreating from a dying star. The priests still climbed the steps of El Castillo to call for Kukulkan's return. But where once the crowd had gathered by the thousands, now only a few remained, their chants swallowed by wind and emptiness. Even the serpent's shadow that descended during the equinox no longer brought joy. It brought fear, a reminder of promises unfulfilled. Legends tell that the final days of Chichen Itza were marked by betrayal and blood. One story speaks of a great revolt, of the Itza priests slaughtered by their own warriors, of fires that consumed the temples, of the gods' silence as the city burned. Others say the people simply walked away, abandoning their sacred city to the jungle, convinced the gods had withdrawn their favor forever. Archaeological evidence suggests both truths may hold weight. Burn marks, broken sculptures, and hastily buried artifacts tell of chaos, yet no single catastrophic destruction. Chichen Itza did not fall in a single night. It faded slowly, tragically, like a candle burning down to its final ember. By the 13th century, the jungle began to reclaim what humans had built. Vines crawled up the sides of the temples. The great plazas filled with soil and silence. Monkeys swung through the columns where warriors once stood, and the call of birds replaced the sound of drums. The sacred cenote, once the city's portal to the gods, grew still and cold. And so Chichen Itza slipped into legend. To the few who remained in nearby villages, It was no longer a city of power, but a haunted place, a realm where the gods still lingered, where the spirits of the sacrificed whispered through the trees. None dared to disturb it. For centuries the jungle kept its secret. The city slept beneath a canopy of green, its stones weathered but unbroken, waiting. The fall of Chichen Itza was not the fall of ignorance or weakness. It was the price of greatness. A civilization that had mapped the stars, carved calendars in stone, and built temples that spoke to the sun had reached too high, too fast. And when the gods no longer answered, the silence became unbearable. But time, ever the patient witness, was not finished with Chichen Itza. For the city of the Feathered Serpent would one day rise again, not in power, but in memory. Centuries passed. The jungle swallowed everything. Where once stood grand plazas and vibrant markets, now only trees and silence reigned. But stone endures when stories do not, and deep beneath the vines the city of the Feathered Serpent waited. By the 16th century, when the Spanish conquistadors first reached the Yucatán, Chichen Itza had already been abandoned for generations. They heard whispers of a lost city hidden in the jungle, a place of gold, gods, and ghosts. The local Maya still spoke of it in reverent tones, calling it the place where the serpent descends. But even they approached it with fear, believing its realms were guarded by divine spirits. It wasn't until the 19th century that the world began to awaken to Chichen Itza's existence once more. Explorers, driven by curiosity and legend, hacked their way through the dense vegetation. When they finally stood before El Castillo, half buried under centuries of growth, they were awestruck. The pyramid's edges were still sharp, its carvings still fierce, as if time itself had been too afraid to destroy it. One of the earliest and most influential explorers, Edward H. Thompson, devoted decades to uncovering the city's secrets. In 1904, he dredged the sacred cenote and pulled from its depths jade jewelry, gold discs, obsidian blades, and human bones, undeniable proof of the rituals once performed there. What he found confirmed both the magnificence and the brutality of the civilization that had flourished here. Over the years, archaeologists pieced together Chichen Itza's story from the ruins. The Temple of the Warriors, the Great Ball Court, El Caracol, and El Castillo revealed a civilization of astonishing intellect and complexity. Hieroglyphic inscriptions spoke of kings, gods, wars, and prophecies, echoes of voices that had been silent for nearly 1,000 years. In the 20th century, restoration efforts began in earnest. The overgrown ruins were cleared, the structures stabilized, and for the first time in centuries, sunlight once again illuminated the carvings of Kukulkan chalk and the stone warriors of the plaza. Scholars from across the globe arrived to study the alignments, the acoustics, and the mathematics of the Maya engineers. They found that the pyramid's geometry reflected not just solar cycles, but planetary movements, lunar phases, and even the resonance of sound. By 1988, Chichen Itza was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing it as one of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. Then, in 2007, it was voted one of the new 7 wonders of the world, a fitting tribute to the civilization that had once mapped the heavens without ever leaving the earth. Today, millions of visitors walk the same plazas where priests once chanted and warriors once marched. They stand in awe as during the equinox the serpent as shadow descends the steps of El Castillo once more, a timeless performance of light and stone. For a few fleeting minutes each year, the ancient ritual repeats itself, and the Feathered Serpent returns just as the Maya had prophesied. But beyond the spectacle, Chichen Itza holds something deeper, a reminder of humanity's eternal quest to understand the universe. The Maya were not simply builders or astronomers. They were philosophers who believed that time was alive, that death was a doorway, and that knowledge itself was sacred. Though the jungle once claimed their city, it could not claim their genius. Chichen Itza stands today not as a ruin of the past, but as a monument to what humans can achieve when they dare to unite the heavens and the earth. The serpent still descends. The shadows still speak. And through them, the legacy of Chichen Itza, the city where gods and mortals once met, continues to whisper its truth across the centuries.